Hello, friends. Welcome to the ATC Double Cut. Today, we're going to talk about turfgrass nutrition and soil testing and that kind of stuff. I have a very special guest today. It is Dr. Beth Guertal, who is, many of you will know her as the turfgrass soil fertility professor from Auburn University. But Beth, I've put up your new job title on the screen. This is a long one. Welcome to the show. And can you tell us a little bit about your current position?
So I retired last June and went to work for Kansas State University, but I'm working remotely. So I basically moved to my garage at Auburn. And it's a position in international agriculture, working with research, extension, and teaching programs in Haiti, and as well as some other countries that will likely come online. Will it have any connection to turfgrass? A little bit, because some of the universities do want to work on turfgrass certificates because they recognize the value of trained Haitians that can move into that enterprise. But a lot of it's just curriculum development and trying to create a better place for ag in Haiti.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of opportunities to share your expertise and much of the expertise that American agriculture has to spread that around the world. I know you did a sabbatical in Mauritius.
I did, yeah.
Which was awesome. That is a country in the South Indian Ocean in the Southern Hemisphere. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. Were you doing anything with turfgrass there?
Yeah, I was. I taught turfgrass management there and then worked with the courses that were there. And I know you visited a lot of those. Well, I say a lot. What are there? Maybe 6 on the island. So for those that are listening, its entire economy used to be sugarcane. Now it's largely tourism with all-inclusive resorts that ring what is just an absolutely spectacular island. So you basically go to Madagascar and you just keep going east and you will run smack into Mauritius.
Yeah, it's at similar latitudes below the equator to where Hawaii is north of the equator. And
Yeah.
I found a lot of similarities between the types of grasses that grow well. So you've got seashore paspalum grows pretty well there.
Yep.
Bermuda grass grows pretty well. St. Augustine grass grows pretty well.
And those were the 3. The courses were like the old course, the Gymkhana Club was almost all seashore paspalum, for example, and it dated to the 20s.
Yeah, I have not been to that one. I don't
It's
think
in the central part. It's not one of the resort courses. So
that was all seashore paspalum, but it's in the center of the island. It's away from the ocean. Yeah. It's cool. It's a beautiful place, and I really want to go back. And my friend Storm Lupier, if you're listening to this, hello.
I don't even know if Storm is there anymore. Well, last time I was there, Storm was there, and I don't know.
Well,
COVID really hit the island. So Storm, if you're here, let us know where you are.
Yeah, as far as I know, he might be. Yeah, he might be there. He's
okay. We overlapped because he was a superintendent at a course in Alabama long ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah, he's worked all over the place. I recently, he was in the Philippines and I got a chance to do some work with him there. So that was cool. So, one more thing about Mauritius. Fine-bladed zoysia is sometimes called mascarene grass. And I think those once were called the Mascarene Islands. Is that?
I don't know. That has never come to mind. It's an odd island in its settlement because the Portuguese were the first to go there, but they never showed any inclination to actually settle it. And then the English and I believe the French decided to have a spat over it. And it was actually under English rule for a long, long time until it became its own entity. I want to say in the early 70s.
And
so it's a cool place. Yeah, I worked there and taught. The kids were with me, which was really fun. We had a good time. They went to school there.
In English or in French?
In English. They learned no French. It was terrible.
Cool. Well, let's jump in to the topic that I want to discuss, which I could talk about Mauritius for a long time because Mauritius is fun. But let's talk about a blog post that I did recently, and it's called Best Judgment of the Agronomist. And that's actually a quote from one of these research papers. And what I
Mhm.
did, this is a 4-minute read. I'll put a direct link to it on the in the show notes so you can check it out. Basically, it's a look at the past 50 years of quotes about soil testing and soil test interpretation. And I started with a quote from Dr. Beard's book, Turfgrass Science and Culture in 1973. And I'll just read this quote and then we'll discuss it. And then I'm going to argue that not much has changed in the past 50 years. So that book was published uh, maybe in 1972, but it's got a copyright in 1973. So I think that is
Mhm.
50 years ago. And on page 442, he wrote, few detailed correlation studies have been conducted concerning turfgrass responses to fertilization with various levels of plant nutrients on soils with various inherent fertility levels. Many soil test recommendations for turfgrasses are based on soil test correlation studies conducted with field crops such as corn and certain pasture grasses. Utilizing these correlations as a base, modifications have arbitrarily been made in applying them to turfgrass conditions. It is unfortunate that adequate correlation studies have not been conducted for turfs. Hopefully, this problem will be corrected in the future. So that was from 1973. And we'll go on through that blog post, and I'm not going to read every single one of the quotes, but there's been a lot of research and review papers and textbooks and so on that essentially restate that. And yeah, I mean, I guess that would have been accurate in 1973, and it unfortunately it hits a little bit too close to home that 50 years later that this problem hasn't quite been corrected in the future for turfs.
Mhm. Nope, I agree, I'm
So,
afraid. And the question is, because I kind of taught on this at GIS show last week, and people are like, "Well, why?" And I'm like, "Well, it's money." I mean, nobody cares to spend the money to get good calibrations or updated calibrations. Who's going to pay for that?
okay, that is a very good point, and maybe could you explain when we talk about what a calibration is?
Mhm.
How what's what's what is it that's lacking? Like, what is a calibration? How would you do it? Um, and then we can talk about why it wouldn't be practical to do it because it would just be
Yeah.
too expensive.
So, and the example I always give that still works well is like, um, have you ever owned horses? Do you know anything about horses? I mean, I'm just asking you that question.
My sister owned a horse.
So, like, if
S-
I say to you, "What size was your sister's horse?" Do you know the answer to that?
I don't remember, but it was some 14 hands
See, so
or
you kind of
16 hands or something.
right, you're kind of calibrated, but the difference between 14 and 16 hands is enormous. Like 14 is almost a pony and 16 is a pretty big thoroughbred, right? So if you're horse sized, you're calibrated. And if somebody came up to me and said, I own a 23 hand horse, I'd be like, really? Because that's a enormous, that's a big, big horse. And
Hmm.
so then the next one we use examples of, we're all calibrated for stimp meter readings, right? We know when somebody says it's stimp 13, we know what that means. We instantly get a vision in our head of speed. And so now there's all these new little ball drop things and like the new, what is that called? The G3 ball that's going to roll on the greens. And the first thing I asked was, well, I'd love to see calibration data. And so that's how we are with soils, because I can, we're calibrated enough that if someone says to me, my extractable soil phosphorus was 400, and I don't care what the extract is in the within the ones that we use, right? From Olson
Yeah.
to Malick to Gray. If they say to me it was 400, I can go, holy crap, you don't need to put phosphorus on for the rest of your career. I mean, that's high. But if they say to me it was 18, I'm not quite sure what to do with that number. I'm probably going to say put a little extra on for safety, but I can't tell you you're going to see a response to applying that phosphorus, because, like the work that Doug Soldat does with Glen Aubert, it looks like you need to go down to like geez, 6 or 7. And when I say these numbers, I'm usually meaning milligrams per kilogram of extractable nutrient, right? And
Hmm.
so that's what I mean when I say calibration. And we would have to have that over a range of soil types, over a variety of extractants, and I would argue we'd have to have those for different crops, right? Because the extractant for paspalum may not be anywhere the same as the extractant for velvet bentgrass.
Okay. And so how would we go about doing uh those? If so, like we've got different grasses used all over
Uh-huh.
the world. They're growing in different climates,
Right.
and
And it
we
really,
have different soil types also. So
right. And
how would we
it
do this kind of study?
you'd have to do it at lots of different places, and it becomes extremely problematic, which is why most every state has a soil testing lab. And where are they getting their calibration data from? They're getting their calibration data from all the work that was done in the 1950s and 1960s, exactly like Jim Beard says, on corn and forage Bermuda and whatever they can cobble together. And because there's just been no resources invested in fixing any of this, we're just merely trundling along with it. And I mean, good Lord, it wasn't until I came to Auburn in like 95, and it took me 10 years of stringent arguing. And like, I actually had to go out and kill centipede grass to show them that we needed a lime recommendation for centipede grass. We didn't have one. No matter how low your soil test pH was, there wouldn't be a recommendation for lime because there was this weird idea that centipede didn't need it. And that's the same way with some of our calibration. And so that's the part where you and I agree on MLSN, that your lower recommendations agronomically, I have no problem with any of them. Because if a superintendent were to call me with like Florida or Alabama recommendations, the first thing I'm going to tell them for most of their nutrients is you can probably cut that in half. You don't need what it's saying.
Okay. That we're talking about so many things. This is such a big topic because fertilization is so important because you talked about killing grass by not making a lime recommendation.
Yeah,
So, I
yeah.
mean, like worst case
And that's not even,
scenario,
yeah.
like worst case scenario is we end up with grass quality that is not as good as we want it to be. And
Hmm.
that's why I tend to be a little bit conservative and
Yeah,
suggest that like I want to make a fertilizer recommendation if it's necessary, and for professionally managed turf, I'd rather err a little bit on the side of safety. And that's
I agree. I
and
agree. So like, I mean, the MLSN for potassium is what, 21,
it's
20, I
third
think.
for potassium on Malik
Uh-huh.
3, it's 37 right now.
Okay. See, and I'm okay with that. And you look again at the body of research and then the stuff that's been coming out with Doug Soldat again. And I know you did a session with him on this for the pink snow mold, right? And
Hmm.
he shows that every additional increment of potassium fertilizer applied increased pink snow mold. So you could argue if pink snow mold is an issue for you, you could drive your soil test K down low. How low? Well, 7, 8. But if I saw that on a soil test report, I'd be like, no, I want to see it between 30, and then I'll go above your MLSN if they have POA and they want to protect the POA, because the work out of Rutgers says, well, you need to keep it around 50. And again, this is all milligrams per kilogram. And that's the same as a part per million for those of you keeping track. So if your soil test reports are in parts per million, that's the same. And so, that's a pretty wide range, isn't it? I just said from 30 to 50, but that's as good as our calibration is right now.
Hmm. So, I I want to talk a little bit about something that people often misunderstand about MLSN, and
Okay.
when I tell this to you, you will probably realize what I'm talking about. So
Mhm.
we're talking about static numbers, but grass is alive. So grass extracts nutrients from the soil.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so when the grass is at 45 parts per million or milligrams per kilogram potassium today, if it's actively growing, then we can expect that it might be at 44 parts per million at some time in the future, which at the
Hmm.
rate that the grass uses nutrients, for a warm season grass, at the rate that they would grow midsummer, we might expect to deplete the soil by about 5 parts per million per month or something like that.
Five
So,
ppm, 5 pounds per acre per month. Yeah, I'm
mm,
okay with that because one of the I did a talk about a year and a half ago on how much nutrients does a growing turf grass crop remove? And what I discovered was that it was incredibly hard to get data on that. That if you start wandering in the research literature, because what do you have to calculate that? Well, you've got to have percent that was in the plant tissue, but then you have to have the yield of the clippings, right? And you have to multiply them to get, oh, yeah, so the turf removed 2 grams of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per every harvest or whatever, right? Excuse me. And if you look in research papers, and particularly in older stuff, they don't tell you that. You've got
mhm.
percent, but you don't have clipping weight. And you can't wrestle the numbers you need. So I did it with everything I could find. And it was really interesting how I think it was like 2 pounds of K2O per 1,000 square feet per year on a warm season, and then you had to go, okay, well, how long are you going to really be mowing this? And okay, let's adjust for the number of months. And it was a lot of differences.
Yeah. So the way that I address this problem is we never really know because we're never going to collect all of our harvest
Right,
and we're never going to, and then you've got some loss by leaching and stuff. But if we're just looking at
right.
what the harvest is, what I think we can do for the harvest is make a simple estimate as a maximum estimate. Because again, I mentioned earlier that I prefer to be conservative, so I'd
Hmm.
rather estimate for healthy grass what's the maximum amount that it would use, and the
Hmm.
maximum amount that it's going to use must be limited by the nitrogen that the grass could potentially take up. So the
Yeah.
nitrogen that the grass could take up is going to be a combination of the nitrogen that is mineralized, the nitrogen that comes from the irrigation water, and the nitrogen that's supplied by fertilizer. So
Hmm.
I think in most parts of the world, we can consider the nitrogen that comes through rainfall to be negligible in
Oh yeah,
comparison to these other amounts.
it's 10 pounds of N per acre per year. That's a very good rule of thumb. I had a colleague that collected all the rainfall for 3 years down in Fairhope, Alabama, which is the most lightning strike activity in the United States, very high. And because they never could get a response to wheat trials down, they ran all these wheat trials and they could never get a nitrogen response. And people kept saying, "Oh, it's in the air. You're fixing it. You're fixing it with lightning activity." And so Wes was like, "Okay, I'm just going to collect it all." And it was 10 pounds per acre per year.
Yeah, it's not as much as people think. I have a couple
Mm-mm.
blog posts about that. Um,
Yeah, I
and
remember what that. Yeah,
and
and
and the United States has a excellent the United States has some reporting on this, some
mhm,
sensors around the country, and
right.
in the UK
It's
there also is. So if you're downwind from a hog feedlot or something, you
yeah,
it
yeah,
spikes. But even
it,
so, it doesn't
it's not
compare with fertilizer or mineralization.
right. And I'll get the question in the golf industry because people will say the greens are real fuzzy, the ball roll's not good. Do you think I'm getting a spike from atmospheric N? And I'm like, nope. I know nitrogen's not related at all to soil testing because we don't have a calibrated test for soil nitrogen, but which makes it such an intriguing nutrient because as fairways get older, and I always tell people, if you've got 25 and 30-year-old fairways or greens, you're mineralizing potentially, the work out of North Carolina. Now that's warm season, 30 pounds of N per acre per year. That's not an insignificant amount of nitrogen.
No, it once you get a bit of organic matter in the soil, it becomes um, ample amounts
Yes.
during the times of the year when you can have mineralization. So
Yeah.
so anyway, the way that I do the maximum estimate is we can sum together all those supplies of N. So if you're
Hmm.
irrigating with reclaimed water, you'll be testing that. You'll know how much nitrogen's in your
Hmm.
water. You know how much water you apply. So you can get all these sources of N, fertilizer N, um,
Hmm.
irrigation water N and mineralized N. You can estimate that. So now you've got your total N that's being supplied. And we know that we're growing healthy turf grass because we expect healthy turf grass is going to have a certain amount of N in it. And so then we can just say, and so we know what the dry weight is. So once
Right.
you know what that N is, and we know that uptake is not 100% efficient. So
Right.
assuming that uptake was 100% efficient, that is our upper bound on how much nitrogen the grass could use. And
Hmm.
then that's the upper bound on what the clipping yield would be, which is then an upper
Hmm.
bound on what our harvest is of phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur,
Yeah.
and all the other elements.
Yeah. And if you really want to be on that lower end, people say to me, well, how efficient is turf grass at taking up nitrogen? 50%. I mean, that number has worked us well for years. And we've tried, we use slow release sources, we use foliar. Yeah, you can nudge it up to 60 to 70 with some of those techniques, but 50% holds us pretty well for a rough seat of the pants and NUE, nitrogen utilization efficiency. And that kind of sucks, really. It's not gotten better in 70 years of crop production. There's a lot of reasons why not, but it works pretty well.
Yeah, so that is a good number that I often use, and it works well. People will be familiar with clipping volume, and so for a lot of golf courses, I recommend uh, taking your annual clipping volume, the total, so you know what your total above ground clipping harvest was, and
Hmm.
if you work backwards. And so let's say you've applied 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, which would be 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, or
Hmm.
10 grams of nitrogen per square meter. If you
Hmm.
look at how much clipping volume that produces, and if you're growing in a sand root zone with relatively low organic matter, it will
Hmm.
often produce the quantity of clippings that would uh, indicate that you have about 50% or 60% uptake efficiency. So you'll
Yeah,
get
I'm
so
yeah.
and so that's just kind of the way it works. So you're sort of like, oh, it looks like we've harvested in the clippings about half of what we applied. So it's something like
Yeah.
that. So
And there's a gorgeous body of work. It actually was Eric Miltner's PhD thesis, and published it like in 1996. And it's still, because he actually looked at all the facets that where nitrogen can go. So he used labeled nitrogen and put it on Kentucky bluegrass and then traced it in the entire system. And what was fascinating was in the first month, most of it just got immobilized, right, in the organic matter. And then over the 2 years of the study, you're dead on. 55% of the nitrogen was taken away in the verdure. It eventually was harvested over that 2 years. But it's a really rapid phenomenon that it goes into the organic system and then it gets mineralized back out. And so it's kind of like I always say, it's you get your paycheck and you'd like to be able to put a big chunk of it into your savings account because you know you're going to just draw out of that when you need it as time goes on.
and I'm going to go back to MLSN and
Mhm.
the I mentioned a few minutes ago about the what did I say? A common misunderstanding about it, and how
Yes.
we were talking about static numbers, but now we've been talking about what happens with nitrogen and how nitrogen is related to growth and nutrient harvest. I use MLSN not to compare to the number. I use it to make a fertilizer recommendation. Okay. And to make a
Mhm.
fertilizer recommendation, I have to have a time component because I need to know if I'm making a fertilizer recommendation for 1 week or 1 month or 1 year.
Mhm.
Okay. And so
Okay.
so I'm looking forward at how much nutrient use is expected. And you know that I'm recommending that people stay at or above the MLSN guideline. And
Mhm.
so the if we test at 50, it often is still going to get a potassium recommendation. Let's use potassium because it's easy.
Right.
So if we're in definitely if I'm in Alabama growing any kind of grass, there's enough uptake that we definitely in a year are going to drop below 37 parts per million potassium if we don't add any. If we start at 50, so that's where I see a lot of people.
Yeah, but this was your PhD work. It depends on the clay mineral too. I mean, you know, I've got a lot of oolitic materials and kaolinites that are going to continue to supply potassium.
Yes, and so you can I and I've written on my blog about this also, and I've talked with Doug about it, where I would suggest that in year one, assuming we don't really know how the soil test changes, I'm going to
Hmm.
make the recommendation based on assuming that the non-exchangeable or mineral forms of potassium in the soil will supply nothing. But then we can see how the soil test changes over time. And so if
Hmm.
it changes less than we would have expected based on the
Hmm.
amount of potassium that was applied, then we can infer that perhaps the soil was supplying something. And then in year two and in year
Yeah.
three and onwards, we can then adjust our recommendation down because we see.
Yeah.
So you see, I'm making the assumption that we're going to drop, let's say, 20 parts per million in 1 year. But
Right.
if
And yeah, and the other quibble I'll have is that, MLSN does kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sort of amortizes over all soil test extractants, right? So you're not too picky as if it's Malic 1, Malic 3, Bray, Olson, or anything, right?
no, Malic 3 is only sorry, I mean, MLSN is only done with Malic 3 data. Although
Uh,
for phosphorus, we also calculated it for Bray 2 and for Olson. Um, but
okay.
uh, I've got a cheat sheet in which a 2-page MLSN cheat sheet. I'll put a link to that in the show notes that
Yeah, and that's
people can
that
check
one
out.
that yeah, that's the one the Pace guys have, right? As well, we can get to through their site. It's
You
got
could
like the
get
great little table right in the center that's kind of red and pink.
well that yeah. So that one I'll put up the Pace Turf website, which is a great source for turfgrass information, paceturf.org. Um, so that is not the cheat sheet. That is kind of the standard guidelines document. But there is an MLSM page at PaceTurf, and that has a link to this cheat sheet that I'm referring to. And there's also MLSM page at the Asian Turfgrass site, which has a link to this cheat sheet. And in that cheat sheet, there's a section about what if I've used an extractant that's not
Ah,
Malic 3. And of
okay.
course, it's pretty easy for the non-acid cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, to make a conversion if you've used ammonium acetate.
Mhm.
And I put some suggestions about how you can handle the case in which you have a different extraction method. But
Wonderful.
but
Yeah, because
basically, we're using Malic 3.
yeah, because we fight it even like Alabama versus Florida. One is Malic 1, one is Malic 3, and it's a really common question, and it's kind of a one-to-one relationship. And Bray 1 versus Bray 2, and now one of the things I discovered when I taught my short course I hadn't seen, and boy, it kind of gives me a heart attack a little bit, is superintendents were bringing their soil test reports in, and we were scanning them and talking about them. And sometimes it would just say available P or available K. It would say available. And I'm looking at the numbers, and the numbers were invariably really low. And
Hmm.
I told them I was pretty sure they were saturated paste extracts because then above it would say total P or total K. And of course, the word total to you and
That's
I
wrong. Yeah, that's
is
wrong.
wrong. Thank you. It's so wrong. And
Yeah.
I said, you're going to have to call your soil test lab and ask them this. And these were some pretty reputable places. I mean, I never really have problems with most of the people that run the soil test reports. And sometimes it wasn't the soil test lab, it was the consultant. And this using this word total is just, and this word available, I really think they were saturated paste extracts,
Yeah,
which
that's so that I've seen that a lot on tests that are run by fertilizer companies, and it's quite understandable why they do it this way, because if you do a saturated paste, which is not a recommend, that is saturated paste is mixing water with soil, and it's very difficult to reproduce it because it depends on the laboratory technician who's doing it, how much
mhm.
exact water they add. But they add water to the soil until it forms. They're stirring it until it forms what they call a saturated paste, which is it glistens, and water is not supposed to be uh, able to escape from it unless you put vacuum suction on it. So you would be stirring it on a table, and it should just form a paste without
Mhm.
water leaking across the countertop. Now, uh, I'm not sure that they actually do it properly like that at the lab, because even if you add just like one drop of extra water, now it's going to leak off. But you're supposed to
Mhm.
bring it up to the point where it is a saturated paste, and then with vacuum suction, you then extract it. That's what you're doing for soil salinity, for
Mhm.
assessing soil
And
salinity.
pH. Mhm.
And yeah, you could do pH that way also, although it's more common in labs to just do a fixed volume. So they'll do a
Mhm.
1-to-1 generally,
Right. Yeah.
because it's faster and they don't have to do the specialized.
Right, but a lot of times, if they're doing that one-to-one, that your point is sound because that's what they're calling saturated paste. So they'll do a one-to-one soil to water or a one-to-one calcium chloride to soil, and they'll call that saturated paste and not do the attention to it like you just described.
Ooh, well, yeah. So yeah, you want to use the best labs possible and make sure you're using standard methods, because otherwise you really can't make sense of the numbers. But
Right.
uh, anyway, if they want to
Well,
call
and
that a
that's
saturated
a really
paste.
that's a really good point, like, back to MLSN, I love that your sulfur number, I think, is 7 or 10, what
Mhm,
is it?
7.
7, because that's I'm writing them to remind myself, because that is really the kind of number that we're finding in all of our sulfur recommendations, and that's another great one because people just run Malic on sulfur, and this is actually I get this question a lot from corn, cotton, and soybean growers, and because we're starting more and more to see responses to sulfur all over the parts of the United States that no longer have extensive air pollution. And 20 some years ago when I started this, we never made a sulfur recommendation. And now I go into cotton and corn and soybeans, like in the mid Atlantic and in Iowa, they're starting to see a response. Now, is it huge? No, 10 pounds of sulfur per acre per year solves the problem. It's like, but I like that you have that number of 7, but the extractant that the sulfur guys tend to like is either a calcium phosphate extract. And yet no soil test lab. One will. I think it's Hair. One of them in the Midwest will run it, but everybody else is just running Malic.
Yeah, there's been a little bit of research that shows that Malic is okay for sulfur,
In
but
fact, I was
it's
talking
like,
to Travis. Yeah, Travis Shaddix told me that they're about to publish a sulfur paper, so I'm really excited to see that in turf.
yeah, and I think he's going to come up with a similar number to MLSN, which 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 is what you find is that the MLSN numbers, even though it's not a traditional um, calibration in any way, the numbers just work, and that's
They
why,
do.
and
I know.
they're
I
reasonable, and
Right.
uh, and so if you make the recommendations the way uh, that I do, assuming depletion of nutrients, then you get a fertilizer recommendation that accounts not just that you're at 45 parts per million, you're above MLSN, but you'll get a fertilizer
Mhm,
recommendation to stay above MLSN. And that's
mhm.
where I'll bring up my blog post again with all these
'Cause
quotes, and
what's phosphorus? 21? Your phosphorus is 21?
phosphorus is 21
Okay. And
and
magnesium is what?
47
See, and that's actually high because for us, my magnesium toggle point is 24
for Bermuda grass.
for all crops. That's how bad our calibrations are.
Oh,
Sulfur is for all crops. Calcium, I do 250. I can't remember what yours was.
right now it's 331, but
Okay.
the reason why it's 331 is because it has a lot of pace data that's from the American Southwest, which naturally, um, the way we did the analysis, we're just kind of looking at what's normal in the data that we were looking at. And in the data
Mhm.
we were looking at, the initial data set has a lot of data from the American Southwest. If you look at the Global Soil Survey, it's like 267.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
when we start dropping out some of the older pace turf data and including more of the more recent ATC data, which are from all around the world, then
Mhm.
uh, the magnesium number is going to come down to something like what the potassium is now. Potassium's going to come down to 30. Phosphorus
Mhm.
is going to stay the same, and calcium's going to be like 267 or 270
Okay.
or something like that.
But I think, and please disagree with me if you do, but I'm basically going to assure the listeners that in 28 years, I have never seen a response to calcium on a turf grass sward that was unrelated to the need to fix pH. So, in other words, if you adjust your soil pH, your soil test calcium is going to hold you in good stead.
Yeah, and I haven't either, and I agree with you. But at the same time, let's look, for example, at some of my clients in Japan. Okay, and
Okay.
I'm gonna describe to you something very practical. They're
Okay.
on, let's say they're on a sand-based root zone with
Hmm.
about 1% organic matter, so it has
Hmm.
a low cation exchange capacity,
Yep. About
and
two. Yep.
something like that. And let's say that their soil potassium is about 250 or 300, so it's below MLSN. And in
Wait a minute.
Japan,
Soil K is what?
sorry, I misspoke. Calcium. We're
Okay.
calcium. Thank you for catching me on that.
It's
Uh,
250 to 300. Okay, got
no,
it.
no, yeah, calcium, not potassium. If
Calcium,
it's
right, not
if your
potassium. Okay.
if your potassium is like that, uh, consider yourself lucky, and you won't have to apply potassium for a while. You don't need to worry about that. And so your calcium's like 250, 300, and the climate is something like Augusta, Georgia, where it is
Mhm.
quite hot in the summer. So you can expect, your roots might be kind of dying.
Mhm.
And it also can rain a lot. So, you figure there might be leaching and disease pressure and so on. And we also know that the grass doesn't have a lot of, it doesn't use a huge amount of calcium. It's just a
So
little bit.
what's the pH of that system?
6.5.
Okay. So no lime recommendation. Okay. Yeah, in that case, I would advocate gypsum. I mean, some kind of calcium source.
And so what I tell my clients when I get that, I'm like, I think your calcium is okay,
Mhm.
but honestly, they're in the bottom they'll be in like the bottom 7% of good
Yeah.
performing turfgrass soils. And I tell them, look, during the periods of the most active grass growth, it's really hot there. It's bent grass. It's really
Mhm.
hot. Their root system might be struggling. And I
Mhm.
tell them, if you want to add calcium, go ahead. We're not,
Yeah,
and it's not trying to change the soil whatsoever because the soil
right.
isn't going to hold it. All I'm telling them is if you want to apply calcium at the rate that would meet the plant requirements, which is tiny because
Right.
calcium is used at about 1/8 the amount of nitrogen. So it's
Right.
just during the periods
So
of active growth, if you're worried about it, I don't care if you
yeah,
apply it.
that's
Go
kind
ahead.
of that's kind of what I would put into a, no harm, no foul kind of thing, and, I used to say that about potassium and then Doug did all that damn work with the snow mold, and I had to back off that, but yeah, to me, what source do you tell them to use for calcium?
I'm indifferent.
Okay,
I
so
I
would
mean,
I. I would use
In Japan, they would often be applying some type of liquid product. So
okay,
it's some
hmm,
type of soluble calcium.
okay, yeah, I'm the same way with that, and in fact, I don't know if I mean, well, they wouldn't need much nitrogen then, but calcium nitrate could be another option as well.
Yeah, it could.
Expensive. Whew,
Yeah,
but
but it's tiny amounts, and
yeah.
that's where. But if they're above MLSN, I just kind of tell them, yeah, you don't need to apply. Well, if
Mhm.
they're above by enough, but see, with calcium, you don't have to be above by very much to not have to apply any because the grass just
Right.
doesn't use it so much.
But this
But
is the fascinating part is because 'cause we're having this whole discussion about calcium, and we're sort of seats of panting it like, "Okay, yeah." There's one paper that looked at calcium, and that was Nick Christian's, and I think he looked at calcium additions in calcareous soils, calcareous putting greens that were made from calcareous sand. That's it. I mean, there's no driver or impetus to have people look at these things, even though they're incredibly important.
Yeah, it's important, but there's a lot of things that we have yet to learn. And in the
Yeah.
meantime, I think MLSN works pretty good to make reasonable recommendations. Um,
And one thing I want to point out is that um, a lot of states are starting to kind of adopt this same idea, like some of the northeastern states that are faced with regulatory emphases on phosphorus, right, are also shoving those phosphorus recommendations sort of to the left on the SLAN curve. So instead of saying the critical soil test for P is 60, which is what it is in a lot of state recommendations. So if you're above 60, you're fine. You don't need to add any more phosphorus. If you're below, you're going to have a phosphorus soil test recommendation. Well, your MLSN is the critical point is 21, right?
mhm.
And so now states are starting to move back to what you have. You're seeing states go to 30 and 40 as the new critical soil test. And I think that's important and I think that's needed.
Yeah, it's if we look at where some of the conventional guidelines are set at, from that very first quote that I gave
Mhm.
from Dr. Beard, it said it was
Right.
arbitrary, that the guidelines have been arbitrarily adjusted. And there's another quote that I'll show here.
Mhm.
This one is from
Bob's. Yeah.
from the book
Yeah.
2001, Carroll, Waddington, and
That is
Rigby.
a
And
great, great book. It's one of my favorite texts.
well, it's a classic, and when they're talking about phosphorus and potassium, I'm not sure that everybody's aware of this, but it's right in the textbook on pages 160 to 164.
Mhm.
I put quotes together from two different pages, but I'll go ahead and read this one too. It says, unfortunately, very little research has been conducted on turf grasses to provide the necessary information required for precise interpretation. Thus, interpretation may be based on research with forage or other crops, or in some cases, no research at all. We've talked about that, and you said it's just kind of like seat of the pants,
Mhm.
and yeah, no research. And then we skip ahead, and they said in some cases, turf grasses have been placed in a high P and K requirement category, while pasture grasses were in a low category. This
Mhm.
decision was based on economics, not agronomics. The cost of fertilization was not considered of primary importance for turf. And that is just classic. Right in the textbook, they state that the requirements, I mean, when they're saying that they're placed in a high requirement category, it means that when they set the guidelines, when these states
Right.
were setting the guidelines, they arbitrarily set it high because they thought turf grass, there's plenty of money to manage turf grass, so they don't need to worry about economics in terms of how
Right.
much
And
fertilizer they
that
apply.
Yeah, and again, a lot the history of how we got there is sort of intriguing because again, what Bob and Don and Paul are saying is based on these calibrations from the 50s and the 60s, right? Well, why did we start to pay attention to even having soil test labs and making fertilizer recommendations? Because of the fact that we destroyed millions of acres of farmland in the 1930s, right? I mean, and then everybody headed west to destroy some more. And so there came this idea it was kind of like the first great recognition of the value of soil, and I would argue that we're entering a new phase of that now. But you go back to that first one, and so often soil test had a thing called a buildup factor, that there was a recognition that horizons were gone and we needed to build the soil back up to be productive for field crops. And so you had a buildup indicator, which didn't really go away. And so some of what MLSN is doing is recognizing that you don't need that buildup factor anymore. We've got that, especially in turf grass, unless it's a really, really sandy or a new construction or things like that.
Yeah, and MLSN is really based on 100% of plant use. So it turns out that we came up with MLSN in 2012. We started working on it in late 2011, and then Larry
Mhm.
presented it at the Boyokos conference in
Yeah, the Wilkes
Philadelphia.
count. I remember
That
that. I was there. Yeah, with
Oh,
all of his
cool.
statistics. Yeah.
And so he presented that in the spring of 2012, and then we I was kind of hesitant at first because it's such a strange way to try to come up with recommendations, and it goes against, and I thought that there would be so much opposition, and there has been some opposition, but what
Mhm.
I thought, okay, we'll present these alternative guidelines, maybe nobody will use it. And it turned out that some people started using it almost immediately. And it was kind of
Mhm.
scary because I thought, wow, that what if they don't get good results? But then people have been getting good results, and then it's come into
Mhm.
use all over the world,
Yeah,
and
and
people get good
yeah.
results. And I never thought it would take off like that. But it's based on something that was also it turns out that I didn't know about it, but the Tom Erickson was doing what are now called the precision fertilization, or Scandinavian precision fertilization,
Oh, yeah.
SPF,
Mhm.
which is the excellent guidelines that you can find on the STURF, the
Right.
Scandinavian
And
Turfgrass Environmental
he's
Research
yeah, and he's
Foundation.
published that in the I mean, he's given talks on that for international turf meetings too, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's two papers that describe it, two peer-reviewed papers that describe it that were
Mhm.
published in about 2012 also,
Mhm.
about how this works on various Scandinavian cool season turf grasses. And what it is basically is saying they just forget soil testing and they just supply nutrients, all the
Mhm.
nutrients, in proportion to how much the grass is using them. And
Mhm.
so that, but that's not so efficient. It guarantees that you won't have any deficiencies, but it's not so efficient because in many cases, what if you do have 250 parts per million potassium? Or what if you have 400 parts per million phosphorus? Well, in
Mhm.
those cases, you definitely don't need to add any of those elements for
Right.
for your lifetime or for 10 years or something like that. And
Mhm.
so if you follow the SPF guidelines, and just supply 100% of plant use, you'll end up over applying some nutrients. And
Right.
so
Right.
where MLSN comes in, it says, here's a floor that we know is safe. So the MLSN
Right.
minimum is a floor that we know is safe. The reason why we know it's safe is because we analyzed a large data set of good performing turf, and we found 10% of the samples were actually lower than that. So we guess that this number is okay, and it turns out that basically it seems to be okay for a lot of grasses, a lot of soils, and a lot of different climates. But then I'm where I was mentioning earlier about trying to account for estimated plant uptake, we kind of are integrating that SPF approach also, because when I'm making the recommendation, I'm considering how much the grass could possibly use and saying, let's make sure that we still keep this safe amount in the soil, which is the MLSN minimum. So
Mhm.
it's interesting that these were developed at about the same time. And I prefer MLSN because we can figure out what's in the soil. And if there already is enough in the soil, which in a lot of cases there is. So when I'm doing soil testing, uh, I often am just making a recommendation saying you don't need anything this
Mhm.
year except nitrogen.
And I tend to I mean, I probably looked at 40 different soil test reports in Orlando last week, and there were about a half dozen where I'd say, "Hey, mess around with a little sulfur on a green and see if you get a response." Because I mean, they were coming to me with soil test sulfur of like 3, 4, and 5. And there were a few that the soil test K had gotten low, but that was it. I mean, there just wasn't anything. Superintendents tend to do a good job of tracking their nutrients and if anything, way over apply the phosphorus. In fact, I just finished an article that I'm going to send to golf course management because a question I always get is, well, I'm seeding, and I've been told that there has to be phosphorus. So should I add more, even if my soil test says no? And so I went and found the research literature, and the answer is very clearly no. And in fact, your MLSN guideline fits really well. There were two papers that sort of saw response somewhere around 30 to 35. And
Mm-hmm.
the Olson paper went down to 15. So, but between 15 and 35 is the critical point that if you're seeding a Kentucky bluegrass or a bent grass, you don't need to add any more. There's plenty already there in the soil, which makes perfect soil science sense. But if you're seeding and you want to make sure you get a good seed stand and somebody tells you you need to apply more, it's a great way to sell fertilizer.
Yeah. And that's so I recommend to people get your figure out your fertilizer recommendations yourself, or work with
Mm-hmm.
an independent consultant, or work with a
Mm-hmm.
university lab or something like that. Um,
Yeah.
but if you're getting your fertilizer recommendations from your fertilizer company, then you can just expect that there is some amount of conflict of interest there. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're happy to deal with that, that's fine. A lot of people are,
Well, and there's a lot of,
for
I
some
mean, I don't
reason.
want to, yeah, I don't want to paint them all. There are some very, very good people out there that want to do the best thing by their client because they recognize that that's how they keep clients. And so, but certainly the superintendent needs to come armed with a base of knowledge about what it looks like and what's needed.
Yeah, but I agree with that, and I think that's something that you've been providing in the seminars that you teach. And you said was it 40 soil tests that you looked at in that
Yeah,
seminar,
I had
recent seminar at
I
the
had,
GCSA conference?
yeah, I had them email them to me, and I got all kinds of great ones. It was really wonderful to see all the different soil test reports.
Yeah, it's a bit chaotic with all the different extraction methods. You know, one of the disappointing things about my PhD research, or well, one of the interesting things is much of it was focused on an extractant, 100th molar strontium chloride, that I think is
Right,
particularly suitable for turfgrass systems. And some of the reasons include it's unbuffered, so the extractant adjusts to the pH of the soil. So the nutrients that are extracted, you can define what they are and say that they were done in a solution with this ionic strength, and in a solution that the ionic strength approximates soil solution. It's dominated
right.
by a divalent cation, which is normal. In fact, strontium is very similar to calcium in some of its behavior, which is why
Mhm.
radioactive strontium is a health hazard, because it can actually substitute for calcium in bones, and be a bit of a problem. But
Oh,
regular strontium is fine, but radioactive strontium is a health hazard. Anyway, it adjusts to the pH of the soil, and so many things. So it works in calcareous soils, it works in acid soils, it works in all the neutral pH soils, and it's a lovely extractant. And because you're using strontium, then you can actually measure calcium in it, which is something that turfgrass managers are really interested in. You can measure pH in it. You can measure
mhm.
dissolved organic carbon in it. You can measure so many things in it. So it has, and also it's quite, because sand root zones tend to have low nutrient holding
Mhm.
capacity, then really strong extractants that have a high ionic strength and have a low pH, like Malic 3, they're extracting a lot of things in sand that are error. And so
Mhm.
I would argue that it increases the error, and certainly the cation exchange capacity. I had one chapter of my dissertation is about CEC, and we never
Mhm.
published that. But Malic 3 overestimates the real CEC of sand root zones by a factor of about 2. So strontium chloride is perfect for sand root zones. So there's a number of advantages to it. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could just make a turfgrass soil test that everybody around the world would use? And I still,
Yeah.
I'm
No,
I've it's just it's there's so much inertia with the extractants that are currently used, and everybody's like, well, we've got all this calibration data. Well, which
yeah,
actually
yeah.
and I'm saying, look, for turfgrass, we don't have it. Why don't we just start
I
over?
know, and then the other
Why don't we use
problem
a
is,
nice extractant?
yeah, and then the other problem is what comes on the soil test reports, because I get, I'm putting up report after report and I'm like, oh yeah, see all this calcium to magnesium ratio, potassium to whatever ratio, ignore it. It's all just garbage. Unless you're feeding cows and you care about that in the, no, you don't need it. And so There's a lot of stuff that still dates back to BCSR theory that makes its way onto these soil test reports, and it just adds to the confusion and the stuff that people don't need.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you don't need, you don't even need to look at on your soil
I
test
know.
report. But the machines at the laboratory are incredible with all the things that they can measure. And
Well,
so it's nice for from a, let's say it's a customer service perspective or something for the labs, they could throw all kinds of things on there.
exactly,
Right?
and that, yeah, but I view it, I mean, yeah, you're right. The ICP spits out aluminum, copper, boron. What the hell am I supposed to do with soil test boron? I can't. I have nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had just been completely ignoring it.
Hmm.
So I'll tell you what I do with it. I had been completely ignoring it and not so even though it was on the report, I would never it's on what I get from the lab so the customers could look at their number, but I would never
Right.
mention it. And I still don't mention it, but now I make a chart of it. So I just show,
Hmm.
and so what I do, and we don't have an MLSN minimum for that, but I look at the soil tests from a particular zone. So I'm looking
Hmm.
mostly it's golf courses. So I'm looking greens, tees, fairways, rough. And I look at
Hmm.
the average from my entire database of samples, the most recent ones over the past 5 years, and I show the median value. So I show,
Hmm.
okay, here's the median value for boron, and here's
Hmm.
where you are. So you can just say, are you above or below the median? And you
Yeah,
can see
and
how far above or below you are, which I
I
think
would
is
ar-
interesting.
I would argue that I'm not even sure if the numbers can get low enough to have any calibrative value. I also wonder if they're even running it in borosilicate free glassware. If it's just coming through the ICP as a number, the lamp is turned on and giving that number. I mean, I did the only boron research that's ever been published in turf, and we did 12 different bent grasses and a loamy sand soil for 2 years and never saw a single response. Now, I'll temper that by saying we went into the greenhouse in pure sand, and yeah, as boron went up, we saw some increases in rooting, but I don't know what to do with that. So maybe in a pure sand soil, it's worth at least a cursory glance.
Yeah. So that's right. I mean, I remember that article, and there's basically nothing there with boron. And where people get scared, you may have had a correspondence with Jim Prusa about this when he was working in Korea, and you'll remember this because he was so scared because they were below detection on boron for all their samples, and he was convinced that they had a boron deficiency. And I'm like, well, that's normal to be below detection.
It just means the piece of equipment couldn't measure it.
Yeah, but the one thing about Jim is he would lay out these. He's retired now, living in Montana,
Oh,
but he would lay out these elaborate test plots of testing every possible fertilizer combination. And so he would tell me that I'm doing it wrong by not asking all my clients to put out these elaborate test plots of every possible end source. And there would be like 40 plots on a practice screen, um, because he liked to get into detail like that. So I would hope
yeah.
that he was testing the boron, but he was convinced that he had a deficiency, and he was trying to base it on the soil test. And I would just say it's a little bit, yeah, with boron, so, that's a tough one to do. But yeah,
I mean,
cursory glance. Now tell me, what's the glassware? What do I need to check?
oh, so
Borosilicate
you think
free?
about this, most laboratory glassware, right, has boron in it. It contains borosilicate glass. So true boron research has to be conducted in either plastic, which probably would be the labs nowadays, or like when we did our study, we had to use borosilicate glassware. So all of our beakers, all of our test tubes had to be free of boron, special expensive glassware. And luckily, a guy who I followed in my career, he had done boron his entire career. So we had this huge cabinet of borosilicate free glassware.
Okay, I'm definitely going to be checking on that and making sure that the boron numbers that
I bet they're
that
running
that
it
I'm
all in
getting.
plastic now that we have this conversation.
I think, yeah, probably. I remember there was a lot of plastic when I was at Brookside, so
Yeah, I'm sure. Oh, I
I'll
love
I'll
Brookside.
confirm
What a
that.
great lab. They do nice work.
Yes, I'm going to be there again in a couple months, and uh, I
Fabulous.
I love all the details about like the they put the standard soils in, and so they've got these standard soils every so often at a random location uh, in the run, and so that's how they can check for quality control.
Yeah,
So
it's just, and I love to, all those labs, they have a regional, they have a work group, right, by region, and they all get together. And because I went down and did their meeting in Florida a couple years ago to talk about our research with polymer coated fertilizers and stuff. And it's just fascinating. I mean, there's such wonks about this stuff. So people listening need to know that, a lot of thought goes into this. And I sort of sit in the room going, oh my God, they're going to spend 2 days arguing about this. But on the other hand, I'm glad that there's people that are invested in that kind of stuff.
yes, but well, Beth, I think we could talk about this for 3 hours,
We
but
could. We probably, we're at the top of the hour.
I see at the timer that we've come to 1 hour, and I don't want to take up much more
Well,
of
and
your
it's 6
time.
a.m. for you, right? So you've probably got people ready to start their day.
Yeah, I suppose that they might be, although it's still pretty quiet outside, and the sun's going to come up in about 30 minutes. I just want to look at this blog post one more time. Of course,
Sure.
I would encourage everybody to read this and read some of these quotes, and the quote, some of these quotes, of course, are from articles that you wrote.
Hmm.
When we look at the potassium and the last two quotes are from articles that you were an author or a co-author on.
Hmm.
So anyway,
Oh, good. And
I'm.
there's your links to the cheat sheet. Oh, perfect. So
Oh,
people
I did.
can.
Yeah, there's a link to the cheat sheet
Okay.
in this. So I'm arguing that the MLSN addresses almost all of these issues of the problem that we're missing the key calibration data for turfgrass. So
Hmm.
I,
Yeah, I'm
I,
afraid I'm going to agree with you on that point. I think, we just need to keep honing in and using the data that people create through research and stuff to just strengthen the data set and get the numbers where we think they should be.
Yeah, I think the thing about MLSN that's kind of nice is it's an active project. So
Yeah, right.
I've been meaning to update. I wanted to update it in 2020 because I thought that's a nice round year, and then I was planning like let's just update it every 5 years. Well, I blew
Hmm.
past the deadline in 2020, and then I thought let's do it in 2022 because that's a nice 10-year anniversary, and then we'll just get on the. Well, I blew past that a couple months ago, so maybe I'll updated. We do have a global soil survey summary that gives a hint at what the next numbers would be because that's on a more
Hmm.
representative data set. But anyway, it is an active project, and I'm pay attention to things like the paper that Travis is going to publish about sulfur, and
I know.
and and we look at the work that Doug's doing about
Hmm.
potassium and phosphorus and so on, and we look at the research that they did at Rutgers about anthracnose and winter kill and so on, and I just
Hmm.
make and that's why I still think that at Rutgers they're looking at static numbers, and I'm saying MLSN, if used the way that I recommend it, we're looking
Right.
at making a fertilizer recommendation. So if you use their soil test numbers and make a recommendation the way that I would say using that I would do it using MLSN, I predict we would get the same benefit, the same
And it's
results.
also, yeah, and it's also important to remember, like the Rutgers stuff, if I remember correctly from talking to Jim about it, that was sort of an ad hoc finding. I mean, that wasn't really the role of the research project, wasn't necessarily to balance K for the POA and the anthracnose. That just sort of came out as a byproduct of the work.
Let me can if you got 2 more minutes, I'll bring
I
up one
do.
more. I'll bring up one more quote. So this is from 1978, and this is also in this blog post uh, from Turner and Waddington. They said a very interesting statement. They said, unfortunately, turfgrass recommendations appear to be based on research done with other crops, such as forages.
Mhm.
And then this is the key part: results from turfgrass fertility studies not designed to relate to soil testing and the best judgment of the agronomist making the recommendations. So
Mhm.
uh, that middle part, the results from turfgrass fertility studies not designed to relate to soil testing, that's what they did
And we see it
at Rutgers.
so often because, you'll have really talented people who aren't necessarily in soil fertility, and they'll put out a study, and almost always it is for disease work, right? And I'll be like, this is really cool. Did you balance for the other nutrients? And they just look at me. Because if you don't work in soil fertility, you don't understand, for example, if you're going to do a potassium study and one of your products is potassium nitrate, everything else has to get nitrogen as the same rate as you put out in your KNO3 treatment. And that's why Doug's work is so profound, because when he did that snow mold work, he had a sulfur control to balance for the potassium sulfate, that was the sulfur in the potassium sulfate that was applied. And so, too much time for going over the 2 minutes, but that's the importance. It's like, now what do you do? What do you do with that data? It's helpful, but it's not just like that quote said. It may not have developed because it was a fertility study.
Well, it's definitely related to potassium. I would just say that if you would apply potassium and consider how much the plant is using over the course of the year, the MLSN is going to make a recommendation for potassium and that's why I'm saying, don't worry about the soil test numbers. Worry about how much you apply as fertilizer. So the uptake, or the amount you apply as fertilizer, the amount that's supplied to the grass, that in turf grass is where I think the effect is. And it's not so much what the actual soil test number is. But I think in order to get the fertilizer recommendation, it's useful to have a soil test if you interpret it using MLSN. So,
Yep.
So I hope this gives everybody who's watching or listening some background info about this interesting topic, and understand some of the reasons why I think MLSN solves all of these problems the best that we can right now. And hearing from Dr. Guertal, you can have some idea about just how complex this issue is, and yeah, just like what some of the problems are where MLSN may not be as strong as I give the impression that it is.
But to finish it up, I think we need to assure people that when they get a soil test report, notice we're not saying those extractions and those numbers are bad. Nobody's saying that. We're just saying the calibration part. What does that number mean in terms of your fertilizer application, and how much or how little you have in the soil in response to turfgrass response? That's what we're talking about.
That's exactly right. So I think that is a perfect point to end this, because otherwise I'm just going to keep talking on and on.
I know, because it's so much fun.
I know this is such a fascinating topic. So yeah, maybe Beth, if you have time, sometime in the future, perhaps we can talk about another. We can continue this conversation sometime and do.
Or we can just go back to nitrogen, because I can do nitrogen for hours. It's so cool. What a great nutrient.
Well, that's a very important one, and that's the one that you really, really need to get right, because that controls growth, and that controls the uptake of all the other nutrients.
Yep.
So, well, thank you, Beth. Have a great weekend, and
I will, and you as well. And I know we'll see you soon. And thank you for having me.
Yes, it's been my pleasure. And you can follow Beth on Twitter at, is it still at AU?
Yeah, it's still at AU Turf, because I can't figure out how to change it. Yeah, and if anybody needs me, you can just find my email and get a hold of me. No problem. All
right, yeah. If you do a Google search for Beth Guertal, it turns up a huge number of hits. You are a prominent scientist, so thank you so much.
It's either me or my brother. They're the only two Guertals in the United States, so you get to us one way.
All right. Thanks so much, Beth. And thanks, everyone.
Have a good one.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching. For ATC from Yantakao, Thailand, I'm Michael Woods. Bye-bye.